Years later, Morgan couldn't remember a single word the judge said during her divorce hearing. What she remembered was Harvey's face, because when she arrived at the courthouse that morning, he was smiling, not nervous, not worried, smiling, the kind of smile people wear when they think the outcome is already decided. Morgan noticed it the moment she climbed out of her old truck. Harvey was standing near the entrance with 2 expensive attorneys and a woman everyone already knew he had been seeing. He looked comfortable, confident, like a man showing up to collect something that already belonged to him. Morgan looked at him for a second, and then started walking. She was carrying 1 folder. That's all. No dramatic entrance, no confrontation, nothing unusual. Then a woman Harvey didn't recognize stepped out of another vehicle carrying a laptop bag and several thick binders. She walked straight past him, didn't introduce herself, didn't acknowledge him. She went directly to Morgan. The 2 exchanged a look, a brief one, the kind that lasted less than a second. Then they walked into the courthouse together, and that was when Harvey's smile disappeared. Years later, Morgan would still remember that moment, not because anyone had said anything. Nobody had, not because a judge had ruled. The hearing hadn't even started, but somehow, standing in that parking lot, Harvey suddenly looked like the only person who didn't know what was about to happen. And the strange part was, Morgan wasn't nervous anymore. Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day. If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from, and subscribe to officially join the family. Long before the courthouse, before attorneys, before hidden accounts and unanswered questions, Morgan met Harvey at a fundraising event in Montgomery, Maryland. At 26, Morgan had plans, not extraordinary plans, just the kind most people have. A career she cared about, a family someday, a life she could feel proud of. Harvey seemed like someone who already had his life figured out. He was older, established, successful, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who rarely heard the word no. When he asked Morgan to dinner, her friends were excited for her. When he asked for a second date, she said yes without hesitation. What stood out wasn't his money, it was his attention. Harvey remembered things, tiny things, the name of her favorite restaurant, the story about her grandfather, the fact that she hated driving in heavy rain. Most people forget details. Harvey collected them, and in the beginning, it felt wonderful. A few months into dating, Morgan mentioned having dinner plans with 2 friends from college. Harvey was quiet for a second, not upset, just quiet. You're seeing them again? Morgan laughed. Again? It's been weeks. Feels more recent than that. The comment wasn't enough to start an argument, not even close. In fact, Harvey smiled when he said it. The conversation moved on. Morgan barely thought about it afterward. Years later, she would remember it clearly. Not because it was important, because it was the first time Harvey made her feel guilty for doing something completely normal. Back then, she didn't recognize it. Back then, it felt like affection. The relationship moved forward quickly. Dinner dates became weekends together. Weekends became holidays. Holidays became conversations about marriage. Morgan's family adored him. Her father respected his ambition. Her mother loved how attentive he seemed. Friends constantly told her she was lucky. And honestly, Morgan agreed. Most of the time, Harvey was easy to love. That was what made everything else harder to see. The concerns never arrived as obvious warnings. They arrived disguised as care. One evening, Morgan talked about a professional development program she wanted to join. Harvey listened carefully, then asked a simple question. Do you actually want to do that? Morgan laughed. Of course. You seem stressed every time you talk about it. She frowned. I don't think I do. Harvey reached for her hand. I'm saying, you don't have to keep proving yourself all the time. The comment sounded supportive, maybe even sweet. Morgan never applied for the program, not because Harvey stopped her, because somehow he convinced her she didn't need it. That pattern would repeat itself many times, not dramatically, not loudly. A suggestion here, a question there, a little doubt inserted at exactly the right moment. And slowly, decisions Morgan would have made on her own started changing direction. The proposal came less than 2 years after they met. Family celebrated. Friends celebrated. Morgan celebrated. She loved him. That part was genuine. Standing at the altar, looking at Harvey waiting for her, Morgan believed she was beginning the safest chapter of her life. She didn't know it yet, but the thing that would eventually trap her wasn't Harvey's temper. It wasn't money. It wasn't even the affairs that would come later. It was the fact that she trusted him completely. And once trust is handed to the wrong person, it can take years to understand what it's costing you. The first year of marriage felt exactly how Morgan hoped it would. Busy, comfortable, predictable. Harvey's business was growing, and together they settled into a life most people admired. They hosted dinners, attended charity events, took vacations, bought a beautiful house. From the outside, everything looked successful, and that was part of the problem. When your life looks good from a distance, people rarely look closer. The first serious disagreement happened over something small. At least it sounded small. Morgan mentioned applying for a consulting position she had seen online. She wasn't looking for money. She missed having work that belonged to her. Harvey looked genuinely confused. "Why would you want another job?" Morgan laughed. "Because I like working." "You don't need to. That's not the point." Harvey shook his head. "I don't understand why you choose stress when you don't have to." The conversation ended there. No argument, no raised voices. A week later, Morgan never submitted the application. At the time, she told herself she had changed her mind. Looking back, she wasn't so sure. Months later, she brought up another opportunity. This time, it was a certification course. Again, Harvey had concerns. The timing, the cost, the usefulness, the workload. There was always a reason, never a command, never a demand. Just enough doubt to make the decision harder. And after enough of those conversations, Morgan noticed something strange. She started asking herself what Harvey would think before making decisions. That had never been true before. Meanwhile, Harvey's success accelerated. New clients arrived. The company expanded. Money became less of a concern. Confidence became less of a strength, more of an expectation. The more successful Harvey became, the more he assumed his opinion should carry the most weight, not only in business, everywhere. One evening, Morgan disagreed with him during dinner. The topic wasn't important, a local issue, something on the news. Harvey immediately shifted into debate mode. Morgan explained her position. Harvey challenged it. She clarified. He challenged it again. 20 minutes later, they were still discussing the same thing. Morgan finally shrugged. "Fine." Harvey nodded, satisfied. The conversation moved on. That became another pattern. Not winning, enduring. Harvey didn't need people to agree with him immediately. He simply refused to stop. Eventually, most people gave up, including Morgan. Around the same time, her friendships began changing, not disappearing overnight, drifting. Melissa called one afternoon. "Want to grab lunch Friday?" Morgan checked her calendar, then thought about Harvey, then thought about the questions, the comments, the inconvenience. Maybe next week. Next week became next month. The same thing happened with other friends. Birthday dinners, weekend trips, coffee invitations. Morgan declined more often than she accepted, not because Harvey forbade her from going, because every plan seemed to create friction, and friction becomes exhausting. One day, Melissa stopped by unexpectedly. They sat on the back patio drinking iced tea, talking about old memories. For a while, everything felt normal. Then Melissa looked at her, really looked at her. "You okay?" Morgan smiled automatically. "Of course." Melissa didn't smile back. "You disappear a lot now." The comment landed harder than Morgan expected, not because it was mean, because it was accurate. For a second, she considered telling the truth, or part of it. Instead, she changed the subject. The visit ended an hour later. As Melissa drove away, Morgan remained outside staring at the empty driveway. Something about the conversation stayed with her. Not enough to change anything. Enough to make her uncomfortable. Years later, she would realize uncomfortable truths often arrive long before we're ready to accept them. The isolation continued quietly. Friends stopped calling as often. Family assumed everything was wonderful, and Harvey seemed perfectly content with the arrangement. Then came a moment Morgan never forgot. An old college friend ran into her at a grocery store. They hadn't seen each other in years. The reunion felt warm, easy, natural. They talked near the produce section for almost 10 minutes. Jobs, family, life. Then the woman asked a simple question. "So, what are you doing these days?" Morgan opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The answer should have been easy. Instead, she found herself searching for words. The pause lasted maybe 3 seconds. It felt much longer. Eventually, she gave a vague answer and laughed it off. The conversation continued. But after they parted ways, Morgan sat in her car staring through the windshield. The question followed her home, not because she lacked value, because somewhere along the way, she had stopped building a life of her own. That realization lingered. Then, another moment arrived a few weeks later, one that bothered her even more. At a family gathering, her father asked for her opinion about a business issue. Before Morgan could answer, Harvey stepped in. "Oh, don't ask Morgan. She'll tell you to trust everyone." Several people laughed. The moment passed quickly. Nobody seemed offended. Nobody even noticed, except Morgan. She sat quietly while the conversation moved on without her, and for the first time, she wondered something she hadn't seriously considered before. When was the last time someone listened to her all the way through before Harvey answered for her? The question followed her for days, then weeks, and while Morgan was trying to understand why she felt increasingly invisible inside her own life, another problem was quietly approaching, one she hadn't noticed yet, because while Harvey was slowly taking up more space in the marriage, he was also spending more time somewhere else, and soon, Morgan would begin seeing signs she couldn't ignore. The first sign wasn't a text message. It wasn't lipstick on a collar. It wasn't a hotel receipt. It was happiness. A kind of happiness Morgan hadn't seen from Harvey in a long time. Not with her. One Thursday evening, he came home unusually energized. He walked through the front door smiling at something on his phone. Not a business smile. Not the satisfaction of closing a deal. Something lighter, more personal. The expression disappeared the moment he noticed Morgan in the kitchen. At the time, she barely registered it. Later, she remembered it perfectly. Because once people start hiding things, small moments become easier to recognize. Over the next few months, Harvey's schedule became increasingly unpredictable. More travel, more evening meetings, more last-minute changes. The explanations always sounded reasonable. That was the frustrating part. Nothing looked suspicious by itself, only when viewed together. One Friday, Harvey canceled dinner plans an hour before they were supposed to leave. Something came up. Morgan nodded. "Work?" "Yeah." He didn't elaborate. Years earlier, she would have asked questions. Now she simply said, "Okay." Harvey seemed surprised by how easily she accepted it. He left 20 minutes later. Morgan ate alone. The reservation went unused. The next morning, Harvey acted as though nothing had happened. The pattern repeated often enough that Morgan stopped rearranging her schedule around his promises. It was easier that way, less disappointing. Then another change appeared. His phone. Harvey had never been careless with it, but now it practically lived in his hand. If he left a room, the phone went with him. If he stepped outside, the phone went with him. If he went to the bathroom, the phone went with him. One evening, the device buzzed while he was in the shower. Morgan wasn't trying to look. The screen simply lit up on the kitchen counter. A name appeared, a woman's name. The notification vanished before she could read the message itself. Morgan stared at the dark screen afterward, not because she had evidence, because her stomach immediately knew what her mind was still trying to deny. When Harvey returned, he picked up the phone without saying a word. The device disappeared into his pocket. The moment disappeared with it. Or at least, that's what Harvey believed. Weeks later, Morgan attended a charity event with him. The room was crowded. Business owners, investors, community leaders, the usual crowd. At one point, Harvey stepped away to take a call. Morgan remained near the refreshments table, speaking with another guest. The conversation ended. Morgan turned and noticed something. Across the room, Harvey was smiling, looking at someone, a woman. The interaction lasted maybe 5 seconds. Nothing inappropriate, nothing obvious. The woman smiled back, then walked away. Harvey returned a minute later. Morgan never mentioned it. The woman might have been nobody. The smile might have meant nothing. But another piece had fallen into place, and the pieces were starting to collect. One Saturday afternoon, Morgan found a restaurant charge on a credit card statement. The expense itself wasn't unusual. The timing was. Harvey had claimed to be attending a client dinner that evening. The restaurant wasn't one clients typically chose. Morgan looked at the statement, then put it away. No confrontation, no questions, because she was beginning to notice something. Every answer Harvey gave created more confusion than clarity, and Morgan was growing tired of confusion. The distance between them became impossible to ignore. Some marriages end with explosive arguments. Theirs didn't. It ended through absence. Conversations became shorter. Meals became quieter. Entire evenings passed without meaningful interaction. One night, they sat in the same room for almost 2 hours. Harvey on his phone, Morgan reading, neither speaking, neither arguing, neither connecting. Eventually, Harvey stood. "I'm heading upstairs." Morgan looked up from her book. "Okay." That was the entire conversation. After he left, Morgan sat alone in the silence. The room suddenly felt much larger, not because Harvey was gone, because she realized she hadn't missed him when he left. The thought unsettled her, not because she hated him, because she remembered loving him. Then came the moment she could no longer ignore. It happened on a Sunday evening. Harvey had fallen asleep on the couch while watching television. His phone rested beside him. The screen lit up. Morgan glanced over automatically. 3 words appeared in the preview before the screen went dark. "Miss you already." The message wasn't from a client. It wasn't from a colleague. And it certainly wasn't from family. Morgan looked at Harvey. He kept sleeping. The television continued playing in the background. Outside, a car passed the house. Everything remained normal, yet nothing felt normal anymore. Morgan didn't wake him, didn't check the phone, didn't create a scene. Instead, she sat there for several minutes, quiet, thinking, not about the message itself, about something larger, because the text wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation. Deep down, she already knew. The evidence had been arriving for months, maybe longer. This was simply the first moment she stopped explaining it away. Later that night, Harvey carried his phone upstairs without realizing what Morgan had seen. He slept peacefully. Morgan didn't, because for the first time, she wasn't wondering whether something was wrong. She was wondering how much she still didn't know, and before long, that question would lead her somewhere Harvey never expected. After seeing the text message, Morgan didn't confront Harvey. That was what surprised her most. Years earlier, she would have demanded answers. She would have asked questions. She would have wanted explanations. Now she felt tired, not physically, emotionally, tired of conversations that always ended in the same place, tired of being told she misunderstood things she clearly saw, tired of arguing with someone who treated honesty like a negotiation. So she said nothing. And once she stopped talking, she started noticing more. The weeks that followed felt strangely revealing, not because Harvey became careless, because Morgan stopped helping him maintain the illusion. One Monday evening, Harvey announced he needed to travel for 3 days. Chicago. Morgan nodded. "What for?" "Meetings." That was the entire explanation. Years earlier, she would have asked which client, which hotel, how long. Now she simply said, "Okay." For a brief second, Harvey looked surprised, as though he expected resistance. The reaction disappeared quickly, but Morgan noticed it. Harvey left the next morning. 2 days later, Morgan received a phone call from a mutual acquaintance. The conversation started normally. Then the person mentioned seeing Harvey at a restaurant the previous evening. In Maryland, not Chicago. Morgan listened, said very little, ended the call, then sat quietly in her kitchen. The lie itself wasn't shocking anymore. What bothered her was how easily it came to him, how natural it had become. That evening, Harvey called from his hotel. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. He sounded relaxed, comfortable. Morgan listened carefully, not to his words, to his tone. People tell different stories when they believe nobody will verify them. When the call ended, she set down her phone and stared out the window. She wasn't gathering evidence. She wasn't building a case. She was finally allowing herself to see reality without defending him from it. And reality looked very different. A few weeks later, another moment happened. A small one, but impossible to ignore. Harvey returned home late. Around 11, Morgan was reading in the living room. When he walked in, He seemed startled to find her awake. "You're still up?" Morgan held up her book. "Couldn't sleep." Harvey nodded, then headed upstairs. As he passed, Morgan caught the scent of unfamiliar perfume. Not overwhelming, not obvious, but there. The smell lingered long after he disappeared upstairs. Morgan closed her book. The room remained silent. No confrontation followed, because there was nothing left to ask. The answers were already arriving on their own. As winter turned into spring, the marriage became increasingly hollow. They still lived together, still attended events occasionally, still appeared married from a distance. But something fundamental had disappeared. One evening, Harvey sat across from her during dinner, scrolling through his phone, half listening, half elsewhere. Morgan looked at him, really looked at him, and realized she couldn't remember the last meaningful conversation they'd had. Not a discussion about schedules, not household logistics. A real conversation. The realization landed harder than any affair, because affairs happen after something breaks. This felt like discovering the break itself. Then came another unexpected moment. One Saturday morning, Harvey left his office door partially open while taking a call. Morgan wasn't eavesdropping. She was walking past, but she heard him laugh. A genuine laugh, warm, relaxed, the kind she hadn't heard directed toward her in years. She paused for half a second, then kept walking. That was all. Yet the sound stayed with her, not because she wanted him back, because she suddenly understood something. Harvey wasn't emotionally absent. He was emotionally invested somewhere else, and those are very different things. A month later, they attended another business dinner. The evening followed a familiar pattern: networking, small talk, introductions. At one point, Harvey excused himself. Morgan remained behind, speaking with another guest. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Eventually, Harvey returned. His mood seemed lighter, almost energized. The guest beside Morgan noticed too. "Your husband seems happy tonight." Morgan smiled politely. "Yeah." The woman nodded. "Good." Morgan said nothing, because for the first time, she wasn't trying to protect the image of her marriage, even inside her own mind. When they arrived home later that evening, Harvey loosened his tie and headed toward the kitchen, then suddenly stopped. "Morgan." She looked up. "What?" Harvey hesitated, only briefly. "You've been different lately." There it was again, the same observation, the same confusion. Morgan waited. Harvey seemed to be searching for words. Finally, he shrugged. "I don't know." "You seem distant." Morgan almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was remarkable. The man who had emotionally left the marriage months ago was now noticing her absence. "Maybe the first AM." Harvey frowned. The answer clearly wasn't what he expected. Neither said anything else. The conversation ended, but something important happened in that moment. For years, Harvey had assumed Morgan would always be waiting, always available, always focused on him. Now, for the first time, he sensed her attention moving elsewhere. He didn't understand why. He didn't understand how far it had already moved, but he felt it, and it unsettled him. Meanwhile, Morgan was beginning to understand something too. The marriage wasn't hanging by a thread. The thread had already snapped. The only thing left was the moment when both of them stopped pretending otherwise. And that moment arrived sooner than either expected. The discovery happened by accident. At least that's how it started. Morgan wasn't investigating Harvey. She wasn't playing detective. She wasn't searching for proof. She was looking for tax documents. That was it. A completely ordinary task on a completely ordinary afternoon. Harvey was out of town, or at least he claimed to be. The house was quiet. Morgan carried a cup of coffee into his office and sat down at the computer. She rarely used it. Over the years, Harvey had made the office feel like his territory. His files, his work, his world. Morgan logged in and started searching for the documents their accountant requested. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Folders, spreadsheets, business records, exactly what she expected. Then she opened a financial file, not because it looked suspicious, because the name sounded relevant. The first thing she noticed was an account number she didn't recognize. That wasn't alarming by itself. Harvey managed most of their finances. There were probably accounts she hadn't seen before. Then she noticed another one, and another. Morgan frowned, opened a second file, then a third. The feeling arrived slowly, the way uncomfortable truths often do, not all at once, piece by piece. The numbers didn't make sense. The transfers didn't make sense. The ownership structures didn't make sense. She leaned closer to the screen. Read everything again. The confusion didn't disappear. It grew, because the more information she found, the more obvious something became. There was far more money moving around than she knew existed. Far more. Morgan opened another folder, then another. The coffee beside her slowly grew cold. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. The deeper she looked, the worse the situation appeared. Hidden accounts, investment holdings, property purchases, business entities she had never heard discussed. At one point, she stopped scrolling, sat back in the chair, and simply stared at the screen, not because she didn't understand what she was seeing, because she did, and that was the problem. Then she found the emails. The folder wasn't hidden. It wasn't password protected, which almost made it stranger. Harvey had become so confident that Morgan never looked at anything that he stopped being careful. The messages were between Harvey and an attorney. At first, Morgan assumed they involved business matters. Then she opened one and froze. The email wasn't discussing contracts, or clients, or litigation. It was discussing divorce preparation. Morgan read it twice, then a third time. The words stayed exactly the same. Divorce strategy, asset protection, financial exposure, risk management. The language felt cold, not emotional, not personal, clinical, as though their marriage were simply another business problem Harvey intended to solve. Morgan continued reading. The next email was worse. Then, the one after that, a timeline emerged, and once it did, everything changed. Harvey hadn't recently decided to leave. He'd been planning for a long time, long enough to move assets, long enough to restructure holdings, long enough to prepare an entire strategy, long enough to ensure Morgan would walk into the process at a disadvantage. Morgan stared at the screen. The house felt strangely silent. The refrigerator hummed somewhere in the distance. Outside, a lawnmower started up across the street. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore, because suddenly the affairs mattered less. The lies mattered less. Even the marriage mattered less. What shocked Morgan most was the calculation, the preparation, the effort. Harvey wasn't simply leaving. He was trying to control the ending too. For a long time, Morgan sat motionless. Most people imagine moments like that as emotional explosions. They aren't. Real shock often looks very quiet. A person sitting alone, trying to reorganize reality. Eventually, she returned to the documents. Not emotionally. Practically, she started reading carefully. Dates, transactions, names, details, patterns. The fear that had followed her for years began changing shape, not disappearing, changing, because uncertainty was finally gone. She wasn't wondering anymore. She wasn't guessing anymore. The truth was sitting directly in front of her. And once a person sees the truth clearly, a decision usually follows. Morgan didn't know what decision she would make yet, but she knew one thing. She would never look at Harvey the same way again. Late that afternoon, she shut down the computer, placed everything exactly where she found it, then walked into the kitchen. Hours later, Harvey called. His voice sounded relaxed, comfortable. He asked about her day. Morgan answered normally, asked about his trip, listened to him lie. And for the first time, she heard the conversation differently. Not because Harvey had changed, because she had. The illusion was gone. The uncertainty was gone. The excuses were gone. When the call ended, Morgan set her phone down and looked around the kitchen. The same kitchen, the same house, the same marriage. Yet somehow, everything had changed, because that afternoon, she discovered something more important than hidden money. She discovered Harvey had already made his decision. And for the first time in years, Morgan realized she needed to make one too. Morgan didn't make her decision that afternoon. Not immediately. That would have been easier. People like to imagine life-changing decisions happen in a single dramatic moment. Most don't. Most happen quietly, over several hours, several days, sometimes several months. That night, Morgan barely slept, not because she was crying. She wasn't, not because she was angry. She wasn't sure she had enough energy for anger anymore. She lay awake staring at the ceiling while Harvey slept beside her. The room was dark. The house was silent. And for the first time in years, she stopped thinking about how to save her marriage. The shift was subtle, but important. Until then, every difficult thought eventually led back to the same question. How do we fix this? That question was gone. In its place was a different one. What happens to me if I do nothing? The answer frightened her, not because she believed she was helpless, because she realized how much of her independence had slowly disappeared. Her career was gone. Most professional contacts were gone. Many friendships had faded. The future Harvey was planning assumed Morgan would be caught off guard, and if she was honest with herself, he wasn't entirely wrong. That realization stayed with her until sunrise. The next morning, Harvey left early. As usual, coffee, phone, keys, brief conversation. The front door closed behind him. Morgan waited until she heard his car leave the driveway. Then she sat alone at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, thinking, not about revenge, not about exposing Harvey, not about winning, about survival. The difference mattered, because once revenge becomes the goal, people make emotional decisions. Morgan couldn't afford emotional decisions anymore. She needed practical ones. By lunchtime, she had reached a conclusion. Simple, uncomfortable, necessary. Harvey had been preparing for years. Now she would too, but she would do it quietly. No confrontation, no warnings, no dramatic declarations. Harvey already believed he understood exactly who Morgan was. There was no reason to correct him. That afternoon, she walked upstairs to a storage closet she hadn't opened in ages. Boxes filled the shelves. Old holiday decorations, photo albums, unused electronics. Near the back sat an aging laptop inside a worn carrying case. Morgan hadn't touched it in years. She carried it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. The machine looked ancient. The battery barely held a charge. The startup screen took forever. Morgan almost laughed. This was not how people imagined rebuilding their lives, not with a dusty laptop and uncertain plans. Yet here she was. Eventually, the screen came to life. She opened a browser, then paused. The cursor blinked, waiting. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. Because this wasn't really about online courses, or jobs, or technology. This was the first decision she'd made entirely for herself in a very long time. The realization felt bigger than the action itself. Finally, she started searching. Certification programs, professional training, business operations, project management, anything that might help bridge the gap between who she used to be and who she needed to become. The amount of information felt overwhelming. Entire industries had changed. Software she once understood no longer existed. Job descriptions seemed written in another language. Several times she considered closing the laptop. Several times she nearly convinced herself she was too late. Then she remembered Harvey's emails, not the affairs, not the lies, the planning, the certainty, the assumption that she wouldn't see any of this coming. Morgan kept going. A week later, she enrolled in her first course. The fee wasn't expensive, yet her finger hovered over the payment button longer than she cared to admit. Not because of the money, because clicking it felt like crossing a line. The confirmation email arrived moments later. Morgan stared at it for several seconds, then smiled. A small smile, private, the kind nobody else sees, because nobody else would have understood why it mattered. That evening, Harvey came home and found her reading in the living room. Or at least, that's what he assumed. The laptop was already put away. The browser tabs were closed. The work was invisible, exactly where Morgan wanted it. "How was your day?" Harvey asked. "Pretty good. Anything interesting happen?" Morgan thought about the course, the enrollment, the decision, the future she had quietly begun building. "No," she said, "nothing major." Harvey nodded and walked away. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. But after he left the room, Morgan sat there thinking about something she hadn't expected. For years, Harvey had underestimated her, not maliciously at first, then intentionally, eventually habitually. And now that assumption was protecting her. because people rarely look closely at someone they've already decided they understand. Over the next several months, Morgan built a routine: early mornings, late evenings, weekends, small pockets of time. Nothing dramatic, nothing exciting. Lesson after lesson, assignment after assignment. Progress came slowly. Some nights she doubted herself. Some nights she felt old. Some nights she questioned whether any of it would matter. Then she kept going, because every completed lesson created something she hadn't felt in years: momentum. And momentum is a powerful thing, especially for someone who has spent a long time standing still. One evening, months later, Morgan finished another certification module and closed the laptop. The house was quiet. Harvey was upstairs. The kitchen lights reflected softly against the dark windows. Morgan looked at the old computer sitting in front of her. The machine Harvey never noticed. The machine he considered worthless. And for the first time since discovering the truth in his office, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Not hope that Harvey would change. Not hope that the marriage would survive. Hope that she would. And that made all the difference. The next opportunity would arrive sooner than she expected. And it would begin with an email she almost deleted without reading. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. Morgan almost deleted it. At first glance, it looked like every other message flooding her inbox. A small project, temporary work, modest budget, nothing remarkable. She nearly moved on. Then she opened it. The company needed help organizing internal operations. The description wasn't glamorous. In fact, it sounded messy. Too many systems, too many moving parts, too many people doing the same job in different ways. Morgan read the message twice, then a third time. Something about it interested her. Maybe because the problem felt familiar. Maybe because for the first time in years, someone was asking for exactly the kind of skills she had been rebuilding. She submitted a proposal, then immediately tried not to think about it. That lasted less than a day. By evening, she was checking her inbox every hour. The next morning she checked it before making coffee. By lunchtime, she felt ridiculous. Then the reply arrived. A short video interview. Nothing more. Morgan stared at the screen. Her heart sped up, not because this opportunity would change her life, because it was the first real test. Everything she had been doing quietly, late at night, suddenly mattered. The interview happened 3 days later. Morgan spent almost an hour deciding what to wear, then laughed at herself. It was a video call. Nobody cared. Still, the nerves remained. When the meeting began, she expected skepticism. Instead, she found curiosity. The hiring manager asked questions. Morgan answered. The conversation flowed naturally. 40 minutes later, the call ended. Morgan closed the laptop, then paced around her kitchen for 10 straight minutes, waiting, wondering, second-guessing every answer. The decision arrived 2 days later. They wanted to hire her. The project wasn't large. The payment wasn't life-changing. But Morgan smiled harder than she had in months, because somebody looked at her skills and saw value. Not potential, not possibility. Value. The distinction mattered. She started immediately. The work was challenging, not because it was complicated, because she was rusty. The first week felt awkward. She checked everything 3 times, sometimes 4. Every email took longer than it should. Every decision felt heavier than necessary. Years of self-doubt don't disappear overnight. One afternoon, she spent nearly 30 minutes rewriting a single response. Finally, she stopped, read the message one last time, and hit send. Nothing terrible happened. The client liked it. The project continued. Morgan laughed at herself afterward. Progress often looks less dramatic than people expect. Sometimes it looks like sending the email anyway. A few weeks later, she completed the assignment. The client was pleased, very pleased. In fact, they requested additional work. That surprised her. Then, something else happened. The first payment arrived. The amount wasn't enormous, not even close. If someone else saw the number, they might have shrugged. Morgan didn't. She stared at it for several seconds, then sat back in her chair. The money wasn't important. The meaning was. For the first time in years, she had earned something entirely on her own. No Harvey, no shared accounts, no dependents, no permission. Her work, her effort, her result. That evening, Harvey came home talking about a business dinner. Morgan listened while preparing dinner. The conversation sounded familiar. Clients, meetings, negotiations. For years, those discussions made her feel smaller. Now, something had changed. Not because Harvey was different, because she finally had something of her own again. A small thing, but real. The confidence didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces. One completed project, then another. One satisfied client, then another. Each success was small. Together, they became something larger. Momentum. Months passed. The certifications continued. The freelance work continued. Morgan became better, faster, more confident. Not perfect. Better. One evening she looked back at work she completed 6 months earlier. The difference surprised her. She had improved more than she realized. That realization mattered, because confidence doesn't usually return through encouragement. It returns through evidence. And Morgan finally had evidence. Then another opportunity appeared, larger than the first, more demanding, more interesting. A small startup company, looking for operational support. The founders seemed overwhelmed. The business seemed disorganized. Most people would have seen problems. Morgan saw potential. She had no idea that answering that email would change the entire direction of her future, or that it would eventually create a life Harvey never imagined she was capable of building. The startup's first video meeting was chaos. Not hostile chaos, exhausted chaos. The kind that happens when good people build something faster than they can organize it. 3 people appeared on Morgan's screen. 2 founders, 1 operations manager. Everyone seemed stressed. Everyone seemed overwhelmed. And everyone seemed to be solving different problems at the same time. For the first 15 minutes, Morgan barely spoke. She listened, took notes, asked questions, observed. Years earlier, she would have worried about sounding smart. Now she focused on understanding the problem. By the end of the meeting, she already saw several issues. Duplicated work, poor communication, missed deadlines, confusion about responsibilities. None of the problems were fatal, but together, they were slowing the company. Confusion about responsibilities. None of the problems were fatal, but together, they were slowing the company down. The founders hired her for a short-term project. 30 days. Nothing permanent. Nothing guaranteed. Morgan was perfectly fine with that. The work began immediately, and for the first time in years, she found herself genuinely excited to start her day. Not every day. Some days were frustrating. Some were exhausting. But the work mattered. That made a difference. The startup wasn't paying her to sit quietly. They were paying her to solve problems. And people listened when she spoke. The first time it happened, Morgan almost didn't notice. During a meeting, one founder proposed a solution. The other founder disagreed. The discussion dragged on for nearly 20 minutes. Eventually, someone turned toward Morgan. "What do you think?" The room became quiet. Morgan offered her opinion. Simple, practical, direct. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dismissed it. Nobody talked over her. Instead, both founders looked at each other. Then one nodded. "That actually makes more sense." The conversation moved forward. The moment lasted less than a minute, but Morgan thought about it afterward. Because for years she had become accustomed to fighting to be heard. Now people were asking to hear her. The difference felt strange and wonderful. Over the following months, the startup improved. Not dramatically, steadily. Processes became clearer. Communication improved. Problems got solved faster. Employees seemed less stressed. Clients seemed happier. Growth followed. One afternoon, Morgan received an email from one of the founders. Subject line, "Quick question." She opened it. The message contained a single sentence. "Do you have time for a call today?" Morgan assumed something had gone wrong. The company was still young. Problems appeared regularly. Instead, the founder smiled the moment the call began. "We'd like to keep you." Morgan laughed. "What did I break?" "I'm serious." The founder leaned forward. "We don't want a consultant anymore." Morgan waited. "We want you on the team." The words caught her off guard. For several seconds, she wasn't sure what to say. The founder continued, "You understand this company better than almost anyone." Morgan shook her head. "I've only been here a few months." "Exactly." The founder smiled, and somehow Things work better now." Morgan didn't respond immediately, partly because she was surprised, partly because she hadn't allowed herself to imagine the possibility. When the meeting ended, she sat alone in her kitchen for a long time, thinking. The offer wasn't perfect. The company was still small. The future wasn't guaranteed, but neither was anything else. A week later, she accepted. The decision changed everything. The work became more demanding. Her responsibilities expanded quickly. Problems became larger. Expectations became higher. And Morgan discovered something she hadn't felt in years. Confidence. Not fake confidence, not motivational confidence. Earned confidence. The kind that develops when people trust you with important things. Months passed, then nearly a year. The startup continued growing. New employees joined. New clients arrived. Revenue increased. The founders started relying on Morgan more heavily. One afternoon, during a strategy meeting, a major client threatened to leave. The room immediately became tense. Several ideas were suggested. None seemed right. Finally, one founder looked toward Morgan. "What are we missing?" Morgan studied the information, thought for a moment, then pointed out something nobody else had noticed. The room went silent. One founder blinked. The other leaned forward. Then both started smiling. The issue wasn't the client. The issue was something deeper, something fixable. Within a week, the problem was resolved. The client stayed. After the meeting ended, one founder stopped Morgan near the door. "You know what your problem is?" Morgan laughed. "What?" "You still don't realize how good you are at this." The comment stayed with her, not because it sounded flattering, because it felt true. For years, Harvey's opinion had slowly become the loudest voice in her life. Now other voices were finally reaching her. People who evaluated her work instead of her obedience. People who respected her contributions instead of minimizing them. People who saw her clearly. The effect was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, life at home remained strangely unchanged. Harvey continued traveling, continued disappearing, continued living inside assumptions that no longer reflected reality. He rarely asked questions about Morgan's life anymore, and when he did, the conversation stayed surface level. "How was your day?" "Good. What are you working on?" "A few projects." "That's nice." Then the discussion ended. Morgan sometimes found it remarkable. The woman Harvey thought he knew no longer existed, and he hadn't noticed, or maybe he never looked closely enough to notice. Then came another meeting, one that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. The founders asked Morgan to join a long-term planning session, not as support, not as an advisor. As a leader, her opinions shaped decisions. Her recommendations shaped strategy. By the time the meeting ended, Morgan realized something. She wasn't helping build the company anymore. She was helping lead it. And somewhere between the old laptop, the online courses, and the countless hours spent rebuilding herself in silence, Morgan had become someone Harvey never expected. The most surprising part? She was only getting started. The first person to notice the change wasn't Morgan. It was Harvey. He just didn't understand what he was noticing. For months, something about Morgan had been bothering him. Not enough to start a fight, not enough to ask direct questions, just enough to leave him unsettled. The problem wasn't what she was doing. The problem was what she had stopped doing. She stopped seeking his approval, stopped explaining every decision, stopped defending herself when he made dismissive comments, stopped reacting the way she always had. And Harvey couldn't figure out why. One Friday evening, they attended a charity fundraiser, the kind of event they had attended for years. Business owners, investors, community leaders, the usual crowd. Morgan spent most of the evening talking with people she genuinely enjoyed. Several conversations involved work, nothing confidential, nothing dramatic, just ordinary professional discussions. At one point, a local business owner asked her a question. "What exactly do you do these days?" Morgan answered honestly. A brief explanation, nothing impressive, nothing exaggerated. The man nodded, asked a few follow-up questions. The conversation continued. Then Harvey joined them. Morgan noticed something immediately. The moment he entered the discussion, he redirected attention toward himself. Not rudely, smoothly, almost automatically. Within 30 seconds, the topic had shifted. Within a minute, Morgan was barely speaking. Years earlier, that would have frustrated her. This time, she simply excused herself to grab another drink. The interaction lasted maybe 2 minutes, but Harvey noticed her reaction. Or, more accurately, he noticed the lack of one. Later that night, driving home, he finally brought it up. "You've been different." Morgan looked out the passenger window. The city lights moved past them. "Different how?" Harvey hesitated. "I don't know." The answer sounded genuine. That surprised her. "You don't get upset about things anymore." Morgan smiled slightly. "That's not true. You know what I mean." She did. The conversation hung there. Eventually Harvey changed the subject, but the question stayed with him. Morgan could tell, because over the next few weeks, he started paying closer attention. Not enough, but more than before. Meanwhile, the startup reached a major milestone. The company signed its largest client to date. The deal changed everything. Revenue projections increased. Expansion plans accelerated. The founders organized a small celebration at the office. Nothing elaborate, just food, drinks, and a room full of exhausted people finally allowing themselves to relax. Morgan stood near the back listening to conversations when one of the founders approached. He handed her a glass, then raised his own to Morgan. The room immediately agreed. People applauded. Some laughed. Several employees started sharing stories. Moments when Morgan had solved problems, fixed mistakes, prevented disasters. Morgan felt herself blushing. "Okay, that's enough." "It isn't," one employee said. Everyone laughed. The founder shook his head. "No, seriously." He looked around the room. This company wouldn't be where it is without her. The room became quieter. Not awkwardly, sincerely. Morgan looked away for a second. The recognition felt uncomfortable. Not because she didn't appreciate it, because she wasn't used to it. For years, she had become accustomed to minimizing herself. Now other people were refusing to let her. A few weeks later, another meeting was scheduled. This one felt different from the start. The founders seemed unusually serious. Morgan assumed something was wrong. She was halfway through preparing solutions before the meeting even began. Instead, one of the founders pushed a folder across the table. Morgan frowned. "What's this?" "Open it." She did. The documents took a moment to process. Then she looked up, confused, then stunned. Ownership, equity, a stake in the company. Not symbolic, real, meaningful. Morgan stared at the paperwork, then back at the founders. Neither looked surprised by her reaction. "We talked about it for months," one said. "You earned it." Morgan struggled to find words. Years earlier, she would have cried. Years earlier, she might have doubted she deserved it. Now she simply sat there, absorbing what was happening. Because this wasn't charity, it wasn't kindness, it wasn't a favor. It was recognition, and recognition hits differently when you've spent years being underestimated. She accepted. The company continued growing. The ownership stake quietly became more valuable. Morgan told very few people, not because it was secret, because she no longer felt the need to announce every achievement, especially to people committed to misunderstanding her. Then came the dinner party. The moment Harvey finally sensed something was seriously wrong. Several couples had gathered at their house. Wine flowed. Stories circulated. Conversations drifted from business to family to money. At some point, the discussion turned toward financial security. One guest joked about retirement planning. Another mentioned market volatility. Then Harvey laughed, leaned back in his chair, and said it. "Morgan would never survive without me." The table laughed politely, some more awkwardly than others. Harvey smiled, waiting for the usual reaction, the embarrassment, the frustration, the argument. Instead, Morgan took a sip of water, then smiled. That's all. No defense, no explanation, no emotional response. A simple smile. The silence afterward lasted less than 2 seconds. Yet it felt longer, because something about the moment confused Harvey. The conversation moved on, but his attention didn't. He kept glancing toward Morgan throughout the rest of the evening, trying to understand, trying to find the reaction he expected. It never came. After the guests left, Morgan carried dishes into the kitchen. Harvey followed. "You didn't seem bothered by that." Morgan looked up. By what? The joke. Oh. She continued loading dishes. It wasn't important. Harvey stood there, watching her. The answer clearly bothered him, because for the first time in years, he couldn't predict her, and people who rely on control rarely handle unpredictability. Well, eventually he left the kitchen. Morgan finished cleaning. The house grew quiet, but upstairs, Harvey remained awake much longer than usual. Morgan knew, because she heard him moving around, opening doors, closing them, walking down the hallway. The behavior wasn't dramatic, just restless, and for the first time, Morgan realized something. Harvey wasn't worried about losing her. Not yet. He was worried about losing his understanding of her. The woman he thought he knew was disappearing. The assumptions he depended on were becoming unreliable, and that uncertainty was beginning to make him uncomfortable. What Harvey still didn't understand was that the biggest surprise wasn't the startup, or the ownership stake, or the career. The biggest surprise was this. Morgan had finally stopped building her life around Harvey. And once that happens, everything changes, including the ending. The divorce papers arrived on a Wednesday. Morgan almost laughed when she saw them. Not because it was funny, because after everything she had discovered, the timing felt predictable. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter for nearly an hour before she opened it. She already knew what was inside. Harvey had been planning this for years. The paperwork simply made it official. When she finally read the documents, she felt something unexpected. Relief, not happiness, not satisfaction. Relief. The waiting was over. The pretending was over. The uncertainty was over. For years, Morgan had been living inside a marriage that existed mostly in appearance. Now even the appearance was gone. That evening, Harvey came home and immediately noticed the envelope. His eyes moved from the paperwork to Morgan. He waited. Morgan recognized the look. He expected questions, tears, anger, something. Instead, she simply nodded toward the documents. You filed. Harvey loosened his tie. Yeah. Silence. A few seconds passed. Then, several more. Eventually, Harvey frowned. That's it? Morgan looked up from her coffee. What else would you like me to say? The question caught him off guard. Not because it was hostile. Because it wasn't. There was no emotion behind it. No panic. No desperation. Nothing. Harvey sat down across from her, almost cautiously. You don't seem surprised. Morgan held his gaze. I'm not. Again, silence. The conversation ended a minute later, but something important happened inside it. For the first time, Harvey looked uncertain. Only briefly, then his confidence returned, because he misunderstood what he was seeing. He believed Morgan's calmness came from resignation, weakness, acceptance. He couldn't imagine another explanation. The truth never occurred to him. Morgan wasn't calm because she had given up. She was calm because she had been preparing. Over the following weeks, Harvey became increasingly confident. The divorce process officially began. Attorneys got involved. Financial disclosures were requested. Meetings were scheduled. Deadlines appeared. Harvey hired an aggressive legal team. The kind of attorneys who treated every divorce like a competitive sport. The kind who advertised victories. The kind Harvey naturally gravitated toward. Morgan wasn't surprised. Winning mattered to Harvey. It always had. Around the same time, his girlfriend stopped being a secret. Not that she had been much of one lately, but now there was no effort to hide the relationship. They attended events together, appeared in photographs together, showed up in places where mutual acquaintances could easily see them. One afternoon, Melissa called. You okay? Morgan smiled. The question felt familiar. Why does everybody keep asking me that? Because Harvey was at a restaurant last night. Morgan waited. And? He wasn't alone. Morgan looked out the kitchen window. A bird landed briefly on the fence before flying away again. I know. Melissa fell silent. You know? I know. The conversation shifted elsewhere. But afterward, Morgan found herself thinking about something. Not Harvey, not the girlfriend. The fact that she genuinely didn't care anymore. Years earlier, the news would have devastated her. Now, it felt irrelevant. That realization told her more about the state of the marriage than any affair ever could. Meanwhile, life continued moving forward. The startup continued growing. Morgan continued working. Meetings filled her calendar. Projects demanded attention. Problems needed solving. While Harvey spent more time performing success, Morgan spent more time building a future. The contrast became almost ironic. One evening, her attorney called. The discussion lasted nearly an hour. Most of it involved logistics, documentation, deadlines, preparation. Before ending the call, the attorney asked a simple question. "How are you holding up?" Morgan considered the answer, then smiled. "Better than I expected." And it was true, not because the divorce was easy, because she wasn't facing it as the same person Harvey thought he was divorcing. That version of Morgan no longer existed. Weeks later, the court date was officially set. The notification arrived by email. Morgan opened it, read it once, then added it to her calendar. Nothing dramatic, just a date, a location, a time. Yet somehow the ordinary appearance made it feel more significant. This wasn't an argument anymore. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a possibility. It was happening. When Harvey learned the date, his reaction was completely different. Morgan overheard part of a phone conversation. He sounded relaxed, confident, almost cheerful, as though the outcome had already been decided. She wasn't offended. She wasn't angry. If anything, she found it interesting, because Harvey still believed he understood the situation, still believed he understood her, still believed he was several steps ahead. And that confidence was about to walk into a courthouse completely unprepared for reality. The hearing was now only weeks away. Harvey expected victory. Morgan expected the truth. Only one of them was going to leave satisfied, and neither of them fully understood how unforgettable that morning was about to become. The morning of the hearing felt strangely ordinary. Morgan woke before her alarm, made coffee, answered 2 emails, reviewed a few notes, then closed her laptop. There was nothing left to prepare. The work had already been done, years of it. Across town, Harvey was preparing very differently. He treated the hearing like the final step in a process he'd already won. His attorneys were confident. His strategy was set. And as far as Harvey knew, Morgan was still walking into this situation blind. That assumption followed him all the way to the courthouse. Morgan arrived first, or at least, she thought she had. The parking lot was already busy. People moved in and out of the building carrying briefcases and folders. Attorneys spoke into phones. Court employees hurried toward the entrance. Morgan parked her aging truck near the back of the lot, the same truck Harvey used to make fun of, the same truck he once called embarrassing. These days, Morgan liked it. The truck was reliable. It did its job. It didn't pretend to be anything else. She turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment. No nerves, no panic, just focus. Then she stepped outside. The morning air felt cool. As she locked the truck, she immediately spotted Harvey. He was standing near the courthouse entrance. Dark suit, expensive watch, perfect posture. 2 attorneys beside him, and standing slightly behind them was his girlfriend. Harvey noticed Morgan at nearly the same moment and smiled. Morgan recognized the smile immediately. Years of marriage had taught her that expression, the smile Harvey wore when he believed he had already won, the smile of a man who expected the rest of the world to eventually catch up to his conclusion. Morgan didn't react. She simply started walking. Harvey watched her approach. The smile remained. At first, then another vehicle pulled into the lot. A dark sedan. Nothing remarkable. The driver parked several spaces away. A woman stepped out carrying a laptop bag and several thick binders. She moved quickly, purposefully, without hesitation. Harvey barely glanced at her. Why would he? She wasn't part of his legal team. She wasn't family. She wasn't anyone he recognized. Just another professional arriving for work. Then the woman walked directly toward Morgan. "Morning." "Morning." The exchange was brief, natural, comfortable. The woman handed Morgan a folder. Morgan flipped through several pages, nodded, said something Harvey couldn't hear. The woman responded. Then they both headed toward the courthouse entrance together. And suddenly, Harvey wasn't smiling anymore. Not completely. Not because anything dramatic had happened. Because something felt off. The interaction looked professional, too professional. The woman wasn't behaving like a friend, or a relative, or someone doing a favor. There was familiarity there, routine, experience. as though they'd worked together many times before. Harvey frowned. His girlfriend noticed. "What?" He shook his head. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing, because for reasons he couldn't explain, the scene bothered him. Inside the courthouse, people settled into the waiting area. Morgan sat with her attorney. The woman sat beside her. Folders opened, documents exchanged. Quiet conversations happened. Everything looked organized, deliberate, prepared. Harvey watched from across the room. The longer he watched, the less comfortable he became. Eventually, one of his attorneys followed his gaze. "You know her?" Harvey looked toward the woman. "No." The attorney shrugged and returned to his paperwork. Harvey couldn't. Something about the situation refused to leave him alone. Several minutes later, one of the court staff approached Morgan. The staff member greeted her warmly, then greeted the woman beside her, by name. The exchange lasted only seconds, but Harvey noticed. Again, another detail, another question. Then Morgan's attorney arrived. The attorney smiled at both women. "Everything ready?" The woman nodded. "Already organized." "Good." The attorney laughed. "That's why you're impossible to replace." Everyone smiled. The conversation moved on. Harvey remained silent, because suddenly one thought kept repeating itself. Who exactly was this woman? The answer arrived a few minutes later, and it changed everything. Harvey happened to cross paths with Morgan's attorney near the hallway. The conversation started casually, professional courtesy, nothing more. Then Harvey nodded toward the waiting area. The woman sitting with Morgan. The attorney followed his gaze. "What about her?" "Who is she?" The attorney looked surprised, genuinely surprised. "You don't know?" Harvey frowned. "Know what?" The attorney blinked, then answered, "That's Morgan's executive assistant." For a second, Harvey thought he misheard him. "My what?" "Morgan's executive assistant." The attorney looked confused by the confusion, then excused himself and continued walking, leaving Harvey standing there. Executive assistant. The words echoed in his head. Executive assistant. The phrase made no sense. Morgan didn't have a career that required an executive assistant, at least not one he knew about. Across the room, Morgan was reviewing documents, calm, focused, prepared. The woman beside her continued organizing paperwork. Neither seemed nervous. Neither seemed overwhelmed. And for the first time all morning, Harvey felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Uncertainty, not fear, not yet. Something quieter, more uncomfortable, because a question had suddenly appeared, and once it appeared, it refused to leave. If Morgan had an executive assistant, what else didn't he know? The courtroom doors opened. People began gathering their materials. The hearing was about to begin. And for the first time since filing for divorce, Harvey wasn't completely sure how the day was going to end. The hearing started 5 minutes later, and within 20 minutes, Harvey realized he had made a terrible mistake, not filing for divorce, underestimating Morgan. The difference mattered. The judge handled the opening proceedings routinely. Introductions, procedural matters, basic disclosures, nothing unusual. For a brief period, Harvey relaxed. Maybe he had overreacted. Maybe the executive assistant meant nothing. Maybe Morgan had simply found a decent job somewhere. The thought lasted less than 10 minutes. Then Morgan's attorney stood, and the first crack appeared. The discussion turned toward financial disclosures, specific accounts, specific transfers, specific assets. At first, Harvey wasn't concerned. Every divorce involved finances. Every divorce involved paperwork. Then Morgan's attorney mentioned an account Harvey hadn't disclosed. His stomach tightened, only slightly. His attorney immediately objected. The judge reviewed the issue. The objection failed. The questioning continued. Harvey sat a little straighter in his chair. Another account appeared, then another, one by one. The room remained calm. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody made dramatic accusations. The facts did all the work. Morgan's attorney produced records, dates, transactions, documentation, everything organized, everything prepared, everything verified. The judge reviewed the material carefully. Questions followed. Harvey answered. His attorney clarified. The questioning continued. And with every passing minute, Harvey's confidence slipped a little further. Across the room, Morgan remained calm. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't staring him down. She simply listened, took occasional notes, spoke when asked, nothing more. That bothered Harvey almost as much as the evidence itself, because she looked prepared, not lucky, prepared. The realization stayed with him. Then things became worse. Morgan's attorney introduced communications involving asset restructuring. The emails. Harvey recognized them immediately. His chest tightened, not because they existed, because Morgan had them. Somehow she had found them. The judge reviewed several documents, then several more. The atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Questions became sharper. Answers became shorter. Even Harvey's legal team seemed less comfortable. One attorney leaned toward him. When did she get access to this? Harvey shook his head. I don't know. And for once, he was telling the truth. The hearing paused briefly before continuing. During the recess, Harvey sat staring at the table in front of him. His girlfriend sat several rows behind. His attorneys whispered quietly among themselves. Across the room, Morgan's team looked organized, focused, prepared. The contrast was becoming difficult to ignore. Then, the hearing resumed, and Morgan's attorney introduced something Harvey never saw coming. At first, he barely paid attention. The discussion shifted toward Morgan herself, her employment history, her professional experience, her recent accomplishments. Harvey assumed it was routine. Then he heard the name of a company he didn't recognize, the startup. Morgan's attorney began outlining the company's growth, its expansion, its increasing market value. Harvey frowned, confused. What did any of this have to do with the divorce? Then Morgan's name appeared in the documentation, again and again and again. Leadership responsibilities, operational oversight, strategic development, executive decision-making. The words sounded unreal. Harvey stared, trying to process what he was hearing. His attorney leaned toward him. You knew about this? No. The answer came instantly, because he didn't. Not even a little. The questioning continued. Witness statements were introduced, business records, performance reviews, growth reports. People described Morgan's role in building the company. The language was professional, specific, detailed, no exaggeration, no theatrics, just facts. The facts were devastating, because every new document contradicted the version of Morgan Harvey had carried in his head for years. The dependent wife, the passive wife, the wife who needed him, the wife who couldn't function without him. That woman wasn't appearing anywhere in the record. Instead, the courtroom was being introduced to someone else entirely, someone competent, respected, trusted, successful. Harvey glanced toward Morgan. For a moment, he genuinely felt as though he were looking at a stranger, not because she had changed overnight, because he had stopped paying attention long ago. Then came the moment that fully shattered the illusion. Morgan's attorney introduced documentation regarding company ownership. The judge reviewed the paperwork, then reviewed it again. Harvey watched the exchange, confused, until the meaning became clear. Morgan wasn't simply working at the company. She owned part of it, a meaningful part. The realization hit him harder than anything else that day, not because of the money, because of what it represented. Years of work, years of growth, years of planning, years of effort, all happening right in front of him, and he never noticed, not once. Across the room, Morgan's executive assistant quietly handed another folder to the attorney. The simple actions suddenly made perfect sense. The title made sense. The confidence made sense. The preparation made sense. Everything made sense. Except one thing. How had he missed all of it? The hearing continued. The judge reviewed additional evidence, additional disclosures, additional financial information. By now, the atmosphere had completely changed. Harvey's attorneys were no longer controlling the process. They were responding to it, trying to limit damage, trying to adjust, trying to recover. Meanwhile, Morgan looked exactly the same as she had in the parking lot. Calm, focused, certain, not because she knew she would win, because she already knew the truth. And truth requires less energy to defend than deception. Near the end of the session, Harvey looked toward Morgan one final time. Their eyes met briefly. Morgan didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't look angry. There was no triumph in her expression, only peace. And somehow that hurt more, because Harvey suddenly understood something. The divorce wasn't the story. The affairs weren't the story. The hidden money wasn't even the story. The story was that while he spent years planning how to leave Morgan, Morgan spent those same years becoming someone he no longer recognized. And for the first time since filing for divorce, Harvey faced a possibility he never seriously considered. He might lose, not eventually, not hypothetically, today, inside this courtroom. And as the judge called for the next phase of proceedings, Harvey sat back in his chair and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer the person in control. The hearing didn't end that day. Most significant legal battles don't. There were additional reviews, additional filings, additional proceedings. But the direction had changed, and everyone involved knew it, including Harvey. The confidence he arrived with never fully returned. Not after the hidden accounts, not after the undisclosed assets, and certainly not after learning who Morgan had become. Over the following weeks, the legal consequences started accumulating. One problem created another, then another. The financial disclosures required corrections. Additional documentation had to be produced. Questions that once seemed harmless suddenly carried weight. The court took the omissions seriously, very seriously, and judges tend to have little patience for people who appear selective with the truth, especially when money is involved. Harvey's attorneys worked tirelessly. Some problems could be explained, others couldn't. The distinction became increasingly expensive. One afternoon, Harvey sat in a conference room reviewing legal expenses. The number at the bottom of the page made him stare longer than expected. His attorney noticed, "It's going to get worse before it gets better." Harvey rubbed his forehead. The attorney wasn't wrong. The legal costs kept growing. The financial scrutiny kept growing. The pressure kept growing. And for the first time in years, Harvey was operating from a position he hated, defensive. Outside the courtroom, consequences were appearing too, not dramatic ones, professional ones, the kind that matter more. Several business associates became distant, not hostile, careful. Phone calls became shorter. Invitations became less frequent. Meetings were postponed, then quietly canceled. Nobody wanted to be connected to uncertainty, and Harvey suddenly carried a lot of uncertainty. One longtime business contact summed it up during a lunch meeting. "People are talking." Harvey looked up. The man shrugged. "I'm not saying they're right, but..." The man hesitated. "But perception matters." That conversation stayed with Harvey long after lunch ended, because perception had always been one of his greatest strengths. Now it was becoming a weakness. The carefully maintained image was slipping, and once public confidence starts fading, it rarely happens all at once. It happens gradually, conversation by conversation, opportunity by opportunity, trust by trust. The girlfriend noticed too. At first, she remained supportive, at least on the surface. She attended events, answered calls, maintained appearances, but something had changed. The excitement wasn't there anymore. The certainty wasn't there anymore. One evening, they sat across from each other at dinner. The conversation felt strained, forced. Eventually, she set down her glass. "You seem distracted." Harvey almost laughed at the irony. "So do you." The woman didn't answer immediately. Then she looked away, and that told him everything. The relationship survived another few months, then quietly ended. No dramatic confrontation, no public scene, no grand farewell. She simply stopped showing up, stopped calling, stopped waiting, and Harvey discovered a painful truth. Some people are attracted to success. Very few are attracted to consequences. By the time the divorce finally concluded, the life Harvey imagined for himself looked very different. The victory he expected never arrived. The future he planned never materialized. And for the first time in a very long time, he had nobody left to blame. Because every major loss traced back to the same decision, he spent years believing he could control the outcome. Instead, he lost control of everything that mattered. And the hardest part wasn't losing money. or status, or reputation. The hardest part was realizing Morgan had seen the truth long before he did, and she walked away anyway, not because she hated him, because she finally understood him. And once she did, there was nothing left to stay for. The strangest part about freedom was how ordinary it felt. Morgan used to imagine that leaving a marriage like hers would come with some dramatic sense of victory. It didn't. There were no fireworks, no life-changing morning where everything suddenly felt different. Instead, freedom arrived quietly, in small moments. The first time she spent an entire day without worrying about someone else's mood. The first time she made plans without considering whether Harvey would approve. The first time she sat in her own living room and felt completely at ease. Those moments mattered more than any courtroom decision ever could. A few months after the divorce became final, Morgan started repairing relationships she had neglected for years. Some conversations were easy, others weren't. Melissa was one of the first people she called. The two met for lunch at a small restaurant they used to visit years ago. For a few minutes, they talked about ordinary things: work, family, life. Then Melissa finally smiled and shook her head. "You know, there were times I thought I'd lost you." Morgan looked down at her coffee. "I know." Melissa wasn't angry. That somehow made it harder. "I should have done better." "You were surviving." Morgan looked up. Melissa shrugged. "I'm not saying it was healthy. I'm saying I understand." The conversation moved on, but Morgan never forgot those words, because healing wasn't about pretending the lost years never happened. It was about accepting them without allowing them to define the future. Family proved more complicated, especially her parents. For years they had seen Harvey exactly the way everyone else saw him: successful, dependable, respectable. The warning signs never looked obvious from the outside. One Sunday afternoon, Morgan sat with them on the back porch. The conversation drifted naturally, until her father finally cleared his throat. "There are some things I wish we'd handled differently." Morgan already knew where this was going. Still, she listened. Her father stared into his coffee. "When you tried talking to us back then." He paused. "We didn't listen well enough." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, honest. Morgan's mother nodded. "We kept assuming things weren't as bad as they sounded." Morgan looked at both of them. Years earlier, she might have wanted an apology. Now she simply appreciated the truth. "We all missed things." Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Nobody cried. Nobody gave a speech. Real life rarely works that way. But when the conversation ended, something felt lighter. The burden of being misunderstood had finally started lifting. Meanwhile, Morgan's professional life continued growing. The startup expanded faster than anyone predicted. New clients arrived. New employees joined. Responsibilities increased. The ownership stake she once viewed as an exciting opportunity gradually became something much larger. The company wasn't merely surviving anymore, it was thriving. One afternoon, a financial advisor walked Morgan through updated projections. The numbers surprised her, not because they were impossible, because they were real. Years earlier, she would have measured success by those numbers. Now she didn't. The money mattered. Of course it mattered. Financial security changes lives. But it wasn't the thing that made her happiest. The freedom mattered more. The ability to choose mattered more. The peace mattered more. Several months later, Morgan purchased a home, not because she wanted to prove anything, because she wanted a place that felt like hers. The process took time. She viewed several properties, rejected some, considered others. Then she found it. A comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress strangers. The kind of place people actually lived in. The day she received the keys, she walked through every room by herself. No agents, no movers, no distractions. Just Morgan. She opened cabinets, looked through windows, stood in empty rooms, imagining possibilities. The house wasn't the largest place she had ever lived, not even close. Yet it immediately felt more like home than the mansion she once shared with Harvey, because ownership isn't about square footage. It's about belonging. That first evening, most of her furniture hadn't arrived yet. The living room sat nearly empty. The kitchen contained little more than takeout containers and bottled water. Morgan sat on a folding chair near the back patio door, eating dinner from a cardboard container. If someone had taken a picture, it would have looked ridiculous. She loved every second of it. The house was quiet, not lonely, peaceful. There was a difference. As the sun disappeared beyond the neighboring rooftops, Morgan found herself reflecting on the previous few years, not obsessively, not painfully, just honestly. The affairs, the lies, the divorce, the rebuilding, all of it felt strangely distant now, not forgotten, finished, and that realization brought an unexpected sense of gratitude, not for what Harvey had done, never that, for what she discovered afterward, her own strength, her own capability, her own independence, things she might never have found if life had remained comfortable. That evening, sitting alone in her new home, Morgan realized something important. The greatest reward wasn't success. It wasn't money. It wasn't even justice. It was peace. And after spending years living inside constant tension, peace felt like the most valuable thing in the world. The funny part was that Harvey spent years believing Morgan couldn't survive without him. Meanwhile, she had built an entire life without even thinking about him most days. And that life was about to give her one final reminder of how far she had come. Nearly a year later, Morgan almost didn't attend the community fundraiser. The invitation had been sitting on her kitchen counter for weeks. Between work, family, and everything else happening in her life, it would have been easy to skip it. Part of her wanted to, the other part knew she should go. So she did. The event was held in a renovated community center near downtown, nothing fancy. Just local business owners, volunteers, families, and organizations raising money for several community programs. The kind of event Morgan genuinely enjoyed these days. People weren't there to impress each other. They were there because they cared about something. That made a difference. The evening started quietly. Morgan greeted a few familiar faces, caught up with old friends, introduced herself to people she hadn't met before. Several employees from the startup attended as well. The company had become involved in local initiatives, and supporting the event felt natural. For most of the evening, Morgan never thought about Harvey once. That surprised her. Years earlier, she couldn't imagine a day where he wasn't constantly occupying space in her mind. Now entire weeks passed without her thinking about him. Healing wasn't dramatic. Sometimes it simply looked like forgetting to remember. At one point during the event, Morgan found herself standing with a group of friends near an outdoor seating area. The conversation drifted from business to travel to terrible cooking disasters. One story led to another. Someone shared an embarrassing vacation story. Another person shared an even worse one. Within minutes, everyone was laughing. Real laughter. The kind that sneaks up on people. The kind that doesn't require effort. Morgan laughed too. And, at that exact moment, someone across the event space noticed. Harvey. He hadn't expected to see her. In fact, he almost didn't recognize her at first. Not because she looked dramatically different. Because she looked comfortable in a way he had never truly seen before. For a moment, he simply watched from a distance. Morgan stood surrounded by people who genuinely seemed happy to be around her, not impressed by her, not intimidated by her, happy. That distinction stayed with him. Because for years Harvey had spent enormous energy building admiration, Morgan had somehow built connection, and connection turned out to last longer. Harvey remained near the edge of the crowd, watching conversations, watching people greet her, watching friendships that appeared effortless. The longer he stood there, the clearer something became. The life Morgan had built wasn't a reaction to him. That realization hit harder than expected. For a long time, Harvey quietly assumed her success somehow connected back to their divorce, as though proving him wrong had been the motivation. Standing there now, he realized how self-centered that belief had been. Morgan wasn't living for revenge. She wasn't living to prove anything. She was simply living, and that was something entirely different. A difficult truth settled over him, slowly, the way important truths usually do. Years ago, Morgan had loved him, not his money, not his status, not his business. Him, before the arrogance, before the manipulation, before he started treating loyalty as something guaranteed, before he assumed she would always stay. And somewhere along the way, he stopped valuing that. Now he finally understood the cost. Across the event space, Morgan happened to glance in his direction. She saw him immediately. For a brief second, neither moved, neither looked away. Years of history existed inside that moment. The marriage, the disappointment, the lessons, the ending. Then Morgan offered a small smile, polite, respectful, nothing more. No anger, no bitterness, no victory, just acknowledgement. The kind people give someone who once mattered in their life. Then she turned back toward her friends. The conversation resumed. The laughter resumed. Life resumed. And that was the moment Harvey understood. Not in the courtroom, not during the divorce, not when the relationship ended. Here, watching Morgan walk back into a life that no longer revolved around him. That was when he finally understood what he had lost. It wasn't financial security. It wasn't public image. It wasn't comfort. It was a woman who had once believed in him completely, a woman who had spent years trying to build a future with him, a woman he underestimated until it was too late. Morgan never looked back again that evening. There was no reason to. The chapter was over, not erased, not forgotten, finished. As the fundraiser continued around her, she found herself listening to a friend tell another ridiculous story. Everyone laughed. Morgan laughed too, and for the first time in a very long time, her future felt wonderfully uncomplicated. Years earlier, Harvey had tried to decide who she was, what she needed, what she could become. In the end, he was wrong about all of it, because the happiest chapter of Morgan's life didn't begin when Harvey lost. It began when she stopped needing him to lose. And as the evening lights glowed softly across the community center and conversations filled the air around her, Morgan moved forward exactly as she was meant to, free, peaceful, surrounded by people who valued her, and completely beyond Harvey's influence. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew exactly who you were? And if you have, what happened when they finally realized they were wrong? Share your story in the comments below. I read as many comments as I can, and I genuinely love to hear your experiences.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.